Billy Graham, the great American evangelist, once related the story of a meeting he had with the Chancellor of West Germany in 1963. When I walked in, Graham says, I expected to meet a tall, stiff, formal man who might even be embarrassed if I brought up the subject of religion. But after the meeting, Graham relates, the Chancellor suddenly turned to me and said, Mr. Graham, what is the most important thing in the world? Before I could answer, he replied to his own question. He said, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If Jesus Christ is alive, then there is hope for the world. If Jesus Christ is in the grave, then I don't see the slightest glimmer of hope on the horizon. Then he amazed me by saying that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was one of the best attested facts of history. The Chancellor's name was Konrad Adenauer. And what Graham did not know when he went to that meeting was that Konrad Adenauer was a devout, lifelong Roman Catholic. This is Catholic Lives, a podcast about famous and worthy Catholics in history. This is Catholic Lives, Episode 2, Konrad Adenauer, 1876 to 1967. Konrad Adenauer was born in Cologne, Germany in 1876 into a Catholic family. His early life was shaped by the so-called Kulturkampf. This was the German government's attempt in the 1870s to bring Catholic institutions such as parochial schools, youth organizations, and the like under greater control from the German government. The papacy had just declared, or First Vatican Council had just declared the doctrine of papal infallibility in 1870, and the German government saw this as a threat. And so they attempted to sort of bring these institutions under its thumb. The attempt failed, but it left a lasting impression on the young Adenauer, who was always opposed to what he called Prussianism, meaning the tendency of German politics toward militarism and authoritarianism. Throughout his life, he fought to prevent state power from being used to dominate the lives of individual people and to instead respect their freedom and dignity. Later on, Konrad Adenauer would become a practicing lawyer in his home city of Cologne. And then in 1906, he joined the Center Party, which was a Catholic political party founded in the 19th century. Rising up through the ranks of the party, by 1917, he had become the mayor of Cologne during World War I, a post he held through the fall of the German Empire in 1918 following the war, and the Weimar Republic, until in 1933, the Nazi Party came to power. The Nazis dismissed him from office in 1933 as mayor, and Konrad Adenauer then went effectively into internal exile, distancing himself from the Nazi government. He left Cologne and moved around the country, short on money much of the time. He even spent several months in a monastery at one point. But he was eventually arrested and sent to a concentration camp toward the end of the war, and was scheduled to be executed when the American Army liberated Cologne in 1945. At the war's end, Americans placed Adenauer back as mayor of Cologne, but Cologne was in the British sphere of influence in Germany after the war, and the British came to resent the attitude of Konrad Adenauer toward them. He wanted them to treat the Germans as equals and not as conquered subjects of the Allied powers. This led the British to remove him, and this in turn would propel him to national prominence, because it meant that he could not be accused of betraying German pride as a lackey of the victorious Allies. Instead, Adenauer embarked on a journey crossing the country in 1945, making contact with different politicians across the country, and eventually in that year helping to found the Christian Democratic Union, a political party made up of both Catholics and Protestants, which was something he had tried to do with the Center Party in the 1920s, but was prevented from doing so by the discouragement of the Catholic bishops at the time. The Christian Democratic Union would help unite West Germany in the post-war years around the twin ideals of Christian democracy and anti-communism, as did Christian democratic parties in other European countries following the war. And so, from 1946 onward, Adenauer's position as someone who refused to work with the Nazis, who had also been ousted by the British, made him an ideal candidate to lead the new West German state, since shortly after the war, Germany became divided between Western sphere of influence, Soviet sphere of influence. And when a constitutional convention was set up in 1948, he was nominated as its head, and then, almost as a fait accompli, he was became the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of West Germany. As Chancellor, Adenauer fought to suppress the influence of communism, as well as extreme nationalism. He fought to have the capital of the new state set in Bonn rather than Berlin, partly because of his dislike for what he called Prussianism. He did have the Communist Party suppressed in the 1940s, perhaps his only sort of tyrannical action, but he thought it as necessary to keep the influence of communism out of the West German state. He also pressed for an end to the denazification policy of the Allies in order to reintegrate the country. Shortly after the war, the Allies had wanted to take basically anybody who had any sort of contact with the Nazis out of public life. Adenauer knew that this was not practical anyway, but also he knew he needed to sort of heal the wound that had happened within Germany, and he successfully lobbied them to bring an end to this policy in the 1950s. And in fact, reintegration was one of the main themes of his career. In 1951, he signed a treaty with had West Germany sign a treaty with France, creating a coal and steel agreement between the two countries. And then later on, in 1957, he helped create the European Economic Community, the precursor of the European Union. Furthermore, he helped cement the West German state's relationship with the United States and Britain, which in turn convinced France to agree to allow the West German state to rearm itself, to build its army up again, as well as to become a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in the 1950s, part of the Common Alliance against communism in the 1950s. And so he thus helped reintegrate the West German state back into the Western world. Domestically, Adenauer worked to reintegrate the country as in addition to all these things by campaigning for the release of the prisoners of war, as well as by negotiating with the new state of Israel for compensation to Jewish victims of Nazi persecution. Adenauer's economic policies represented a model of what's called a mixed market economy, one in which market capitalism is tempered with social welfare policies. In this case, influenced by Catholic social teaching and featuring programs to help families, paid leave for working mothers, saving schemes for home ownership, social security programs, and other assistance designed to help families. During his tenure, the West German economy thrived and raised the standard of living of Germans so much across the board that it is sometimes referred to as an economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s. In a time of division and tension in Europe, Adenauer was the great elder statesman of his age, someone who sought unity and peace within Europe and reconciliation within Germany itself, while still vigorously opposing the threat of communism. Informed by his Catholic faith, he left a lasting legacy to the German people. In 1963, West German Republic signed a treaty, the Élysée Treaty, with France, which cemented the friendship between the two countries. This was a momentous occasion, as the conflict between France and Germany, dating from the 1870s, had been at the heart of the conflicts that had led to the First World War, two World Wars. And so this renewed friendship is what has set the foundation for lasting peace in Europe up to our own day. Adenauer was guided in all things by his deep Catholic faith, and he saw the Catholic faith as the key to overcoming both the hatred and distrust that existed within his own country, but also the threat from the atheistic communism of the USSR, and more broadly to the sort of materialistic spirit of the age in Western Europe. In an interview shortly before his death, he stated that, quote, "Europe's roots are Christian. If they are cut, Europe cannot thrive. To the anti-spirit of materialism and the chaos of nihilism, we must convincingly oppose the image of a Christian order determined by the principles of justice and charity." The German people have long since recognized Adenauer's achievement as Chancellor. In 2003, a public television station in Germany conducted a poll in which over 3 million Germans voted, in which they declared Konrad Adenauer to be, quote, "the greatest German of all time." Thus, this is our Catholic Life for this week. Konrad Adenauer, from 1876 to 1967, Chancellor of West Germany and uniter of the German people and the peoples of Europe, inspired by his Catholic faith. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher or whatever platform you find us on. Please like and subscribe to our podcast. Leave comments if you can, suggestions. They are welcome. Please share and please get the word out. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please look forward to new podcasts coming in the future. Thank you.